Not every genre is the belle of the ball. For every first-person shooter, there's an item shop simulator. For every open-world sandbox, there's a sports game where you only interact with spreadsheets. Sometimes it's obvious why a genre is niche, but some genres lose their spark slowly over time. Take on-rail shooters. There aren't many of them anymore, and the ones that do get made can be pretty hit or miss. They seem like they should be pretty easy to make. You just take a ship, put it on a rail, jam in some enemies, and you're done, right? Well, not really. Let's dive into games on rails, and what you have to do to make them live up to their potential. Know what else is tricky? The internet. Use a VPN, like today's episode sponsor, Surfshark. Surfshark is a VPN, which helps protect your privacy online. Connect to their servers, and Surfshark will automatically encrypt your data and help keep it safe from prying eyes. Passwords, bank info, your personal photos and texts. Surfshark will help keep your secrets secret. You can also use it to disguise what country you're connecting to streaming services from, which opens a whole new world of content that the man doesn't want you to see. Check out what's on Netflix in India, or watch the BBC by heading over to the UK. Surfshark works on phones too. They have a super easy interface that can get you secure and ready with just a click or a tap. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it. Click the link below or go to surfshark.deal/designdoc and use code DESIGNDOC at checkout to get 83% off plus 3 extra months totally free. Secure your internet with Surfshark. So what's interesting about games on rails? It's right there in the name, the rail. They're unusual because they take away some or all of a player's freedom of movement. Sometimes you're automatically moving forward, sometimes you're just stuck in a box that's traveling along the rail, but games on rails restrict your movement in one way or another. That might not seem like a huge change, but it tinkers with the player's attention economy. People have a finite amount of attention to give. There's only so much stuff in a video game that a player can keep track of at any one time. The rail removes the hows, whens, and wheres of movement from the list of things players have to pay attention to, and because of it, the player can use that freed up bandwidth for other things. But that shifts the responsibility back to the game designer to use that bandwidth for something worth paying attention to. How well they manage that task is super important to how well the game on rails will be received. So what can you add to a game to keep players occupied? For one, you could crank up the spectacle. Few rail shooters lean into spectacle harder than Sin and Punishment's Star Successor. Treasure is a developer whose hallmark is explosive arcade-style action games, and that's why they have been so successful at developing games on rails. It's not enough in a rail shooter for you to just be shooting as you drift through a level. In a perfect world, you're going to be blown away constantly as you're playing. Star Successor has a steady stream of new things to show you over its 7 lengthy main stages. Each covers a setting and tries to pack in as much to do as possible. Take the second one. It's set in an underwater tunnel, full of enemies and twists that lean into the stage's setting and theme. There are schools of fish monsters to shoot, submarines with missiles to reflect, soldiers that ride in on jet skis, and giant eels that lash out at you from outside the tunnel. You'll occasionally break out of the tunnel and dive into the ocean, changing the pace of play for a few seconds as the water slows you down. The camera will keep spinning and changing perspectives, altering the dynamic of how enemies will appear and how you'll handle them, and giving more chances for treasure to wow you with set pieces as you glide through the level. It's a non-stop barrage of new and relevant things to do, making it one of the more memorable stages of the game. The stage's boss is as spectacle-ridden and thematic as the rest of it, and fits in with Treasure's history of unique boss design. You're fighting a shapeshifter who turns into different sea creatures. A manta ray, a seahorse, and man's greatest foe, a bunch of dolphins. The patterns are unique and constantly changing throughout the fight. You're never waiting around long for something new to happen, which carries through the whole game. Different stages are themed differently. Ruined cities, sky fortresses, haunted Japanese forests, but all carry with them that density of action and spectacle that the genre really needs to shine. You might say, well duh, having cool stuff happening around you is important to any game, right? Well sure, but especially for rail shooters. It might be tough to get a sense of how important spectacle is to a rail shooter in a vacuum. You don't know what you have until it's gone. We need a game with all the basic mechanics of a rail shooter, but without that flash. Oh hey, Kingdom Hearts. Here's one of the gummy ship sequences in Kingdom Hearts 1. See if you can spot the problem. So what's wrong with this segment? Is it A, the lighting profile is weird, B, no dolphins, or C, nothing is happening? If you chose B, come on, it's C. The Gummy Ship sections in Kingdom Hearts 1 are the poster child for a bad on-rails shooter segment. They're minigames that show up as you travel from world to world, and they're mandatory. The only problem is, unfortunately, a huge one. Nothing happens. There's just no spectacle. There's no camera work, nothing interesting is coming at you. The course is a line, straight on till morning. Oh hey, I found it. The backdrops are abstract tie-dye nothings. It's a shooting gallery full of basic obstacles and enemies with bland designs, with no real depth or challenge in their shooting patterns or how you have to avoid them. It's barely a rail shooter. If there's any silver lining here, it's that you can customize your Gummy Ship to get through these segments faster. Slap some armor, engines, and weapons onto your Mega Bloks ship, and the game will practically play itself. And later on, you even get a fast travel option to skip these sections entirely. Now they did bring back the Gummy Ship in the sequel. Did they learn from their mistakes? Wow. Yes they did. Spectacle may be important, but it isn't the be-all end-all way to make your game stand the test of time. Relying on that alone to carry a rail shooter can be a crumbling foundation. The original Panzer Dragoon, I'm sorry to say, hasn't aged all that well. The game was built with its 3D environments you fly through as the main draw, and for the Saturn era, that was plenty. But for the modern era, the game doesn't look all that much different than other rail shooters. The draw has degraded. It's a problem that the 2020 remake unintentionally highlights. The game is absolutely faithful to the original, with updated visuals and nearly identical mechanics, but the shooting is pretty simplistic. Without the dazzling environments, the relative shallowness of the game's mechanics are more exposed. It's not really the fault of the developers that their game hasn't aged well, but it does help explain why something so beloved in the past probably won't hit a new player as hard in the modern era. Thankfully, the sequels are much better, thanks to better controls and faster pacing. Contrast Panzer Dragoon with a game like Rez. Rez was all about spectacle, but it has aged much better for a couple of reasons. 1. The stylized visuals are much more of an aesthetic experience rather than trying to wow you as a technical showpiece. 2. The game does a much more thorough job of tying the gameplay into the music and visuals, with the player's actions building the soundscape and the look of the level as you progress. It's delivering an experience not as easily found in more and more games as time goes on, and the game gives you more of a reason to return because of it. What you show players is important, but so is when. Good pacing can make or break games on rails. A well-paced game on rails has a lot in common with a roller coaster. Light gun games like House of the Dead and Time Crisis are stuck on a track, and they aren't graphical showpieces, but they work because of their frenzied pacing and physicality. They have incredibly simple gameplay. Enemies come at you from all angles and demand you deal with them, but the player's actions are very basic. There's no movement to worry about, just point and shoot as fast as your arms will let you. When you're done, it's immediately off to the next screen full of more action. They were perfect designs to catch on in arcades. Even with short sessions, the super dense gameplay and ultra fast pacing were tailor-made to compel players to pump in quarter after quarter. Light gun games are showcases for how to think of games on rails as a thrill ride, where freeing up a player's attention from movement lets them turn their focus to the action. But have you thought about what would happen if they took the thrill out of the thrill ride? What if you added everyone's favorite sorta bug lady, Yar? If I've piqued your interest, check out Yar's Revenge. You know the Atari game. No? Well, they rebooted the Atari game. It's a rail shooter. Like Sin and Punishment, Yar's Revenge lets you control the target reticle and your character separately, and the controls feel okay at least. You've got the basics here, power-ups, lock-on missiles, a dodge, but the problem lies with the level design. The pacing is just awful. There's a complete lack of variety in the enemies. Each stage pits you against the same handful of dudes with the same basic attack patterns over and over. It doesn't count as non-stop action if it's just the same action repeated non-stop. There aren't really any environmental set pieces or much of a sense of progression. I'm flying around, but I don't feel like I'm actually heading anywhere. The first couple of stages are so similar visually that I wasn't quite sure if I was flying through reused level assets or not. The boss fights are different at least, but to get to each one, you have to slog through 10 or 15 minutes of cookie cutter basic enemies. There's some comms chatter, though it's not voiced and not really tied into the action happening in the stage. It's pretty forgettable. You've got these DeviantArt looking cutscenes in total silence to look forward to, so that's something. Great rail shooters don't have to be locked in this arcade-centric quick bites gameplay style. Star Fox 64 is a classic because it nails those aspects that make for good arcade rail shooters while bringing more to the table than most other games on rails even try. Star Fox 64 was originally a technical showpiece. The original SNES game was in that first generation of 3D games on home consoles, and the sequel on the N64 looked fantastic for its time. The game itself was full of lasers and explosions, flashy set pieces, and unique environments you played through. The pack-in Rumble Pack brought a tactile dimension to the game that no one had brought before. It was a must-play in 1997. But if that was it, it wouldn't be the classic that it remains to this day. The game backs up that flash with a structure, characterization, and dense yet accessible control mechanics that few games of this type even try, let alone succeed at, including later Star Foxes. The game stages have a ton of variety, mixing settings, vehicles, and objectives, with some even breaking out of the rail completely for a bit of arena-based dogfighting. The stages are filled with different paths and secret goals that will determine where you go and how you will travel to the endgame. A single run only takes 1 or 2 hours to complete, but the variety of paths you can take to get to the end, with completely different stage sets and places to go to within those stages, means the game is ultra replayable. The characters are classics for a reason, with lovable comms chatter and a fantastic Saturday morning cartoon vibe that carries throughout. The villainous Starwolf will appear at unexpected times depending on what you've done and how you've dealt with them before, and helps repeated playthroughs feel more fresh and alive than what you'd usually find in a game on rails. And while the game can be beaten with just your basic lasers and some rudimentary flying skill, the game's advanced upgrades, lock-on targeting, maneuvering, in-depth combo and high score system, as well as difficult stage medals and plenty of extras to unlock, give it a higher than expected skill ceiling for something so accessible. Star Fox 64 brings together the best qualities of a great game on rails, with that extra accessibility, characterization, and depth that takes it from great to classic. So most of the best on-rails games have been these high-speed action thrill rides that scream for your attention. But what if we pump the brakes? Can a slower, more grounded rail game work? Well, yeah, if you've got Pokemon. The Pokemon Snap games take the on-rails formula and twist it in a more puzzly direction. Instead of shooting everything down with fast and loose accuracy, you're taking a slow and relaxed photo safari through the world of Pokemon. You're working with the rail to line up your camera shot and using your limited toolset to manipulate Pokemon behaviors to get the right pose at the perfect moment. The game's scoring system doesn't have any appreciation for good photography, but it's still fun enough to work as a game mechanic. You try to balance the size, pose, and positioning of each subject as you puzzle your way towards creating the perfect scene for the ideal shot. The game has plenty of replayability, with over 200 Pokemon to find with a variety of unique behaviors to discover and capture on film. As you go along and take more photos, the areas you go through will level up, completely changing the scripted events, adding new Pokemon or putting them in new scenes. Whether you want to go for a high score or get a genuinely great shot, the Switch version of Pokemon Snap will give you plenty to do, making it one of the more unusual and content-rich rail shooters out there. And of course, there are a bunch of games on the edges of the genre, experimenting and taking the game on rails to new and exciting places. Sayonara Wild Hearts blends a spectacular aesthetic a la Rez, with rhythm-based gameplay and action deeply tied to the music. It's advertised as a pop album video game after all, and it nails that for sure. Every moment and scene is carefully crafted and timed to the beat, pretty close to a big QuickTime event combined with a traditional rail shooter. It's short and dense with content, easy to replay, and has plenty to see on your second, third, or fourth run. The highest medals will require you to be very familiar with the soundtrack and execute on what you know perfectly on time. It's a small, beautiful game that goes well beyond just another cookie-cutter rail shooter. If you want something that works in a genre not often seen in a rail shooter, try Ring Fit Adventure. It's not the most complicated game, but where the physicality of a light gun game took a very simple design and made it fun, Ring Fit Adventure does the same with a Pilates ring, a leg strap, and real-world exercise. It's a light RPG whose movement is completely on rails and divided into stages your character runs through in a straight line. All combat, menu control, movement speed, target shooting, and minigames are done by you doing actual exercise. The game is a pretty straightforward basic RPG, with a light turn-based combat, skill trees, armor, and spell systems, but thanks to the controls being entirely driven by real exercise, the effort put into it makes it all compelling. As you get your heart rate up and feel the burn, you'll be plenty happy to deal with a simple system. The on-rail elements fill your freed up attention with actual exercise, and it's all in service of a noble goal, to make getting moving fun and accessible. It works on every level. Xzodiac is currently in development, but they've got a demo ready to go that I recommend checking out. It's an indie game that draws heavy inspiration from the SNES Star Fox, but with a ton of modern refinements, aiming for something like Shovel Knight or Freedom Planet, but for rail shooters. The controls feel excellent, the pacing is great, and both the enemies and bosses have a ton of thought put into their attack patterns and bouncy animations. If you're looking for a modern throwback to that very specific Mode 7 look and feel, look no further. Head down to the comments where we've got 2 topics to discuss: your favorite on-rails games and why you love them, and any other genres that you feel are also tricky to make. We might make an official series out of this. I think the more hyper-specific the genre you mention, the more fun the discussion will be. Thanks again to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this episode. Click the link in the description to sign up. Games on rails are deceptively tough to make. Removing traditional movement frees up a player's attention to focus on other parts of the game, but they have to fill it back in with something worth paying attention to. The designers of games on rails get the chance to make new types of games that can't be made any other way.